On a Tuesday morning in late October of 2019, every apple tree in the northern half of Sauk County, Wisconsin, was dying at the same time. Not slowly, not ambiguously. The kind of dying that makes a grower's hand shake when he walks the rows and realizes the problem isn't isolated to one block, one variety, one corner of the property. The kind of dying that spreads like a rumor. Quiet at first, then everywhere at once. Growers who had replanted with the new Geneva Rootstock series over the previous 5 years were finding their trees in collapse. Leaves gone yellow-brown and curling inward. Bark splitting at the graft union. Root systems that had looked perfect in the nursery catalogs now rotting in place from a combination of fire blight pressure and a wet spring, followed by a brutally dry summer. The extension office was getting calls it didn't know how to answer. The co-op in Baraboo had a waiting room that looked like a triage center, and in the middle of all of it, one orchard was fine. Not struggling, not partially damaged, fine. The trees were loaded. The fruit was clean. The harvest was coming in on schedule, and the bins were full, and the old Mack truck that hauled them to the cider press was making its third trip of the week, while every other grower in the county was on the phone with their insurance agent. That orchard belonged to a 23-year-old woman named Willa Tesdall. And the reason it was fine is a story that starts not in 2019, but in 2016, when Willa came home from the University of Wisconsin with a horticulture degree, a notebook full of research, and an idea that every serious apple grower in Sauk County, Wisconsin, told her was a waste of perfectly good ground. Let me tell you about Willa Tesdall, because you need to understand her before you can understand what she did, and you need to understand what she did before you can understand why it mattered. Willa was the third generation of Tesdalls to farm the same 180 acres on the west side of County Road F, about 7 miles north of Reedsburg. Her grandfather, Clement Tesdall, had planted the first apple block in 1961. 12 acres of McIntosh and Cortland on seedling rootstock, trees that grew slow and lived long and produced fruit that was never going to win a beauty contest, but tasted like something you'd actually want to eat in November, when everything else had gone soft and mealy. Clement had farmed those trees the way you farm something you intend to hand to someone else. Carefully, patiently, with the understanding that an apple orchard is not a crop, it is a commitment. His son, Willa's father, Delmar Tesdall, had taken over the farm in 1989 and expanded the orchard to 40 acres. Delmar was a methodical man. He kept records in a green 3-ring binder that lived on the kitchen counter, and those records went back to the first year he'd taken over. Spray dates, harvest dates, yield per variety, price per bushel, cost of inputs. He wasn't a visionary. He was something more useful than that. He was consistent. He understood what the orchard needed, and he gave it what it needed, and for 27 years the orchard had given back. Willa had grown up in those rows. She'd carried picking bags before she was tall enough to reach the lower scaffold branches without a step. She'd learned to identify scab and powdery mildew and codling moth pressure by the time she was 10. She'd watched her father consult that green binder the way other people consult the weather forecast, not for certainty, but for orientation. And somewhere in those rows, between the old McIntosh trees her grandfather had planted and the newer Honeycrisp blocks her father had added in 2004, she had started asking a question that nobody around her seemed to be asking. Why were they replacing the old trees at all? Let me tell you about the rootstock question, because it's the center of this whole story and it's more interesting than it sounds. For most of the 20th century, Apple growers in the upper Midwest planted trees on seedling rootstock or on malling series rootstocks that produced trees of moderate size with deep, extensive root systems. These trees took 8 to 10 years to reach full production. They lived 40, 50, 60 years. They were drought-tolerant because their roots went deep. They were resilient to wet years because those same roots had the mass to survive temporary saturation. They were expensive to harvest because they were tall, but they were cheap to maintain because they were tough. Clement Tesdall's original Macintosh trees were still producing in 2016. They were 55 years old. Their trunks were as thick as a man's thigh, and their root systems went down 6 feet and out 15 feet in every direction. And they did not care about dry summers or wet springs because they had seen both, and they were built for both. Starting in the late 1990s and accelerating through the 2000s, the industry began a major push toward what the extension services called high-density planting on dwarfing rootstock. The Geneva series, developed at Cornell, was the flagship. Geneva 41, Geneva 935, Geneva 969. These rootstocks produced trees that were small, 8 to 10 feet tall rather than 25. You could plant them at 300 trees per acre instead of 80. They came into production in 3 to 4 years instead of 8 to 10. They produced more fruit per acre in the early years. They were designed for mechanical harvesting platforms. The economics looked extraordinary on paper, and the Extension Service promoted them aggressively. And the nurseries loved them, and the equipment dealers loved them, and by 2010, high-density Geneva replanting was the dominant conversation in every apple-growing county in Wisconsin. The problem, and this is the problem that Willa Tesdall had been reading about in the university library for 2 years before she came home, was that the dwarfing rootstocks had shallow, fibrous root systems. They needed support posts and trellis wire. They needed consistent irrigation because they couldn't reach deep moisture. They were more susceptible to replant disease, and some of the Geneva series, particularly in heavy clay soils with poor internal drainage, were showing vulnerability to crown rot and fire blight at the graft union in ways that the long-term field trials hadn't fully captured yet, because the long-term field trials were only 15 years old, and the problem was a 20-year problem. Willa had found 3 papers on this. One from a researcher at Michigan State named Dr. Anita Wierzbicki, published in 2014, tracking crown rot incidents in high-density plantings across the Great Lakes region over a 12-year period. One from a Cornell Extension Bulletin, 2015, flagging specific soil drainage interactions with Geneva 41 in heavy textured soils. And one from a Swedish research station, Willa had read it in translation, documenting a similar collapse pattern in high-density apple plantings in Scania province after a sequence of wet spring, dry summer years that stressed the shallow root systems beyond their recovery threshold. She had all 3 papers in her notebook. She had highlighted them. She had written margin notes. She had run the numbers on her father's 40 acres and compared the soil drainage maps from the county extension office with the rootstock distribution of every block on the farm. And she had concluded, with the particular certainty of a 22-year-old who has done the reading and cannot understand why everyone else hasn't done the reading, that the Tesdall farm should not replace the old trees. Not one of them. She brought this to the kitchen table in June of 2016, 3 weeks after she came home. Delmar Tesdall listened. He was a quiet man who listened the way farmers listen, with his eyes on the table and his hands around his coffee cup and his face giving away nothing. Willa laid out the 3 papers. She explained the root depth comparison. She showed him the drainage maps. She told him about the Swedish study. She told him that the old Malling-Merton 111 rootstock trees, her grandfather's original blocks and the trees her father had planted in the early years, had root systems that could survive the exact stress sequence the papers were describing, and that the Geneva series trees they'd been planning to install in the East Block that fall were, in her assessment, a significant risk in Sauk County's soil profile. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Willa's mother, June, who had been doing dishes at the sink, turned around and leaned against the counter and looked at her daughter with an expression that was not quite pride and not quite worry, but something in between. Delmar set down his coffee cup. He said, "I need to think about it." He thought about it for 2 weeks. Then he told Willa that she could manage the East Block herself, on her terms, with the understanding that the rest of the farm operated as it always had. The East Block was 14 acres. It had 12-year-old trees on Geneva, 935 rootstock that were already in place and would stay. But the 3 acres of ground at the north end that they'd cleared the previous fall, the ground they'd been planning to replant in high-density Geneva, that ground was hers to do with as she thought best. It wasn't a ringing endorsement. It was a farmer's version of "let's see." Willa planted those 3 acres with trees on Malling-Merton 111 rootstock, semi-dwarf. She chose Honeycrisp and Crimson Crisp and a cider variety called Bittersweet that nobody in the county was growing commercially. The trees were going to take longer to produce. They were going to be harder to harvest. They were going to look, for the first 3 years, like nothing much was happening. And that was fine with Willa Tesdall, because she had read the papers and she understood what she was doing. Let me tell you about Hank Crowley, because he is part of this story and you need to understand him too. Hank Crowley was 61 years old in 2016 and had been the primary sales representative for Lakeside Nursery and Orchard Supply out of Portage for 22 years. He knew every apple grower in Sauk County and most of the growers in Columbia and Juneau counties as well. He had a firm handshake and a good memory for names and a genuine enthusiasm for the new Geneva rootstock series that was not entirely disconnected from the fact that Geneva-based trees were his highest margin product. He was not a dishonest man. He believed in what he was selling. He had seen the early yield numbers from the high-density trials, and they were impressive. And he had been telling growers for a decade that the future of Wisconsin apple production was intensive, high-density, Geneva-rooted systems, and he had sold enough of them to believe he was right. He came to the Tesdall farm in August of 2016 for what he assumed was a routine fall planting consultation. He'd been selling the Tesdall's trees for 15 years. He expected to walk the cleared north end of the East Block and talk spacing and variety selection and trellis installation. He did not expect to find Willa Tesdall standing in that block with a soil probe and a drainage map. He listened to her plan. He was polite about it. He looked at the papers she showed him, the Wierzbicki study, the Cornell Bulletin, the Swedish research, and he nodded in the way that experienced salespeople nod when they are deciding how to redirect a conversation. Then he said that the Geneva series had been extensively trialed and that the concerns she was describing were edge cases in poorly managed soils, and that the Tesdall Farms East Block had adequate drainage for the rootstock, and that planting on MM111 in 2016 was, and he said this with a smile that was genuinely friendly, a little like buying a horse when everyone else has a tractor. The silence that followed lasted about 2 seconds. Then Hank laughed, and two of his colleagues from the nursery who'd come along for the visit laughed, and Delmar Tesdall, standing at the edge of the block with his hands in his jacket pockets, did not laugh, but he didn't say anything either. Willa looked at Hank Crowley for a moment. She was 22 years old, and she was standing in a field, and a 61-year-old man with 22 years of industry experience had just compared her research to buying a horse. She said, "The horse doesn't need a trellis system and it doesn't drown in a wet spring." Then she went back to her soil probe. Hank Crowley sold the Tesdalls nothing that day. He drove back to Portage and he told his colleague in the truck that the Tesdall girl was going to learn a hard lesson about why the industry had moved on from MM111, and his colleague agreed, and they talked about something else for the rest of the drive. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. How many times have you watched someone with credentials and experience look at someone younger or newer or less credentialed and laugh? Not cruelly, not maliciously, but with the comfortable certainty of a person who has never had a reason to question what they know? That laugh is not about the idea being laughed at. That laugh is about the laugher. It is the sound of a person protecting something. A worldview, a business model, a professional identity, by dismissing the thing that threatens it before they have to seriously consider it. Hank Crowley was not a bad man. He was a man who had been right for a long time, and being right for a long time makes it very hard to imagine being wrong. The fall of 2016, Willa planted her 3 acres. She set her trees at a spacing that would have seemed extravagant to any high-density advocate. 14 feet between trees, 20 feet between rows. She installed no trellis wire. She did install a simple drip irrigation line, not because the MM111 rootstock needed it, but because she wanted to give the young trees every advantage in establishment. She mulched the tree rows with wood chips to build organic matter and suppress competition. She kept a notebook, the same kind of green 3-ring binder her father used because she'd grown up watching him reach for it, and the habit had become instinct. In the spring of 2017, Hank Crowley sold 47 orchards in Sauk and Columbia Counties' New Geneva-rooted trees. In the spring of 2017, Willa Tesdall watered her young MM111 trees and wrote in her notebook and waited. Let me tell you about the years that followed because they are the reason this story exists. 2017 was an unremarkable year for Sauk County apple growers. The spring was dry enough to worry about, the summer was hot but manageable, and the Geneva-rooted high-density plantings that had gone in over the previous 5 years performed more or less as advertised. The early planted blocks were in full production. Yields were high. The per-acre numbers looked good. Hank Crowley had a record year in sales. At the Tesdall farm, Willa's 3 acres of young MM111 trees sat in their rows and grew slowly and produced nothing, as young apple trees on semi-dwarf rootstock do in their first and second years. Delmar walked through them in September and said nothing, which Willa had learned to interpret as neither approval nor disapproval. Her mother asked how they were doing. Willa said they were doing fine. 2018 was the first year Willa's trees produced fruit. Not much, a few clusters per tree, enough to evaluate the varieties, not enough to fill a bin. But the trees were healthy. The root systems, now in their second full growing season, were establishing the deep, branching architecture that MM111 is known for. Willa measured root depth in a soil pit she dug at the edge of the block in November. The primary roots were already at 32 inches. She wrote that in her notebook. The Geneva-rooted blocks across the county continued to produce well. The Extension Service published a report that fall citing Sauk County's high-density conversion as a model for upper Midwest apple production modernization. Hank Crowley was quoted in the report. He said the future was bright. 2019 was the year the future changed its mind. Let me tell you about what happened in the spring and summer of 2019, because it is the reason that October morning looked the way it did. April of 2019 was the wettest April in Sauk County since 1993. Not wet in the way that inconveniences people. Wet in the way that fills drainage tiles and saturates soil profiles and sits in the low spots of fields for 3 and 4 weeks at a time. The Geneva Rootstock series, with its shallow, fibrous root system, does not tolerate prolonged soil saturation well. The roots sit at 8 to 14 inches of depth. When that zone is waterlogged for more than 2 to 3 weeks during the active growing season, oxygen deprivation begins to damage root tissue. The trees don't die immediately. They look stressed. They push out a weak flush of growth. They go into summer already compromised. Then June came, and June of 2019 was the driest June in Sauk County since 2012. The soil profile, which had been saturated in April, baked out from the top down through May and June. The shallow Geneva root systems, already damaged by the spring saturation, were now in the worst possible position. The moisture zone they depended on had dried out, and they didn't have roots deep enough to reach the moisture that remained at lower depths. Stress compounded on stress. And in that condition of compounded stress, fire blight, which had been present at low levels in the county for years, found exactly the kind of weakened tissue it needed to move aggressively. By August, growers were calling the Extension office. By September, the calls had become something closer to panic. By October, the damage was visible from the road. Rows of trees with brown curling leaves and splitting bark at the graft union. The characteristic shepherd's crook of fire, blight on the new growth, and underneath it all, root systems that had simply given out. 43 of the 47 orchards that had purchased Geneva-rooted trees from Hank Crowley in 2017 reported significant losses. 17 of them reported losses exceeding 40% of their planted acreage. 3 growers lost their entire new plantings. The county estimated the aggregate loss at somewhere between $4 and $6 million in future production capacity, because these weren't just trees. They were 5 to 8 years of establishment investment gone. At the Tesdall farm, Willa walked her 3 acres of MM111 trees in October and found them loaded with fruit and completely unaffected. Let me tell you about why, because the why is the point. The MM111 root system had gone deep. By the fall of 2019, Willa's trees, now in their 4th leaf, had primary roots at 48 inches. And lateral roots extending well beyond the drip line of the canopy. When April's saturation came, the upper soil profile had been wet, but the roots were distributed across enough depth that the damage was minimal. When June's drought came, the trees drew moisture from 30, 40, 50 inches down, moisture that the shallow Geneva roots couldn't reach. The trees didn't experience the same stress sequence, and because they weren't stressed, their natural disease resistance held. The fire blight found nothing to exploit. The bittersweet cider apples in the north end of the block had set a full crop. The honey crisp were clean and heavy. The crimson crisp were the best colored fruit Willa had ever seen off those trees. She filled 14 bins off 3 acres. At the market prices that fall, which had risen sharply because regional supply was down, Those 14 bins returned more per acre than the farm's established high-density Honeycrisp block had returned in its best previous year. Delmar Tesdall walked through the block with his hands in his jacket pockets. He stood under one of the Honeycrisp trees for a long moment. Then he said, "You were right." 3 words. Delmar Tesdall was not a man who spent words he didn't mean. That evening at the kitchen table, he slid the green binder across to Willa and told her she was managing the rotation going forward. All 40 acres. She could decide what stayed and what came out and what went back in and on what rootstock. He would keep the records. She would make the calls. June Tesdall, standing at the counter, said nothing, but she was smiling in the direction of the window, and the window faced the orchard. Let me tell you about what happened that November, because it is the part of the story that most people in Sauk County remember best. Hank Crowley drove out to the Tesdall farm on a Tuesday in mid-November. He'd driven past the property 3 times in October, which Willa's neighbor had mentioned to her, and each time he'd slowed down at the gate and looked at the orchard. The 3rd time, he'd stopped and gotten out of his truck and stood at the fence line for a few minutes before driving on. Willa heard about this from her neighbor, the way you hear about things in a county of a few hundred farms. Not because anyone was watching, but because someone always is. He knocked on the door at 9 in the morning. Willa answered it. He had his hat in his hands, which was not the posture of a man who'd come to sell something. He said he'd been looking at the damage reports from the county. He said he'd been on the phone with Cornell and with the extension office and with 3 of the growers who'd lost the most acreage. He said he was trying to understand what had happened and what he should have been recommending differently. He said he'd heard that the Tesdall East block had come through clean, and he wanted to know why. Willa looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "You told me I was buying a horse when everyone else had a tractor." Hank Crowley looked at his hat. He said, "I remember." She said, "The horse didn't need a trellis, and it didn't drown in the spring, and it didn't dry out in the summer, and it's standing in that block right now with 14 bins of clean fruit off 3 acres. She paused. "The tractors are in the shop." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he asked if he could walk the block. She said yes. They walked it together for 40 minutes in the November cold, and Willa showed him the soil pit she'd dug in 2018 with the root depth measurements written in her notebook, and she showed him the drainage map, and she showed him the 3 papers, the Wiersbicki study, the Cornell Bulletin, the Swedish research, the same papers she'd shown him in August of 2016 when he'd smiled and redirected the conversation. He read them this time, or he read enough of them to understand what they said. He asked her what she thought growers in the county should do now, the ones with damaged Geneva-rooted blocks. She told him. She said the blocks that had lost more than 30% needed to be assessed tree by tree before any replanting decision, because replanting into already stressed soil without addressing the drainage and organic matter situation would repeat the problem regardless of rootstock. She said that any replanting in the county's heavier textured soils, and she pointed to the drainage map and showed him which townships those were, should seriously consider MM111 or Malling 7 as rootstock options rather than defaulting back to the Geneva series. She said the high-density Geneva system was not wrong everywhere. It was wrong in specific soil conditions that the county had not adequately characterized before recommending it universally. Hank Crowley listened. He was a man who had been right for a long time, and listening was not his most natural posture, but he was listening now with the particular attention of a person who has recently been wrong about something expensive and is trying to understand how. He left 2 hours later. He did not apologize exactly. He said, "I should have read those papers in 2016. That was as close as he got, and Willa accepted it, because she was not interested in his apology. She was interested in the growers who'd lost their trees. Let me tell you about the 2 years that followed, because the story doesn't end in November of 2019. Hank Crowley did something that Willa had not expected him to do. He changed his recommendations, not quietly, not incrementally. He changed them publicly. In January of 2020, he presented at the Wisconsin Apple Growers Association winter meeting in Madison. He stood up in front of 200 apple growers and extension agents and said that the industry's blanket promotion of the Geneva high-density system without adequate soil type qualification had contributed to the losses in Sauk County, and that he personally had sold trees into conditions that the research, if he'd read it carefully, suggested were inappropriate. He cited the Wiersbicki study. He cited the Cornell Bulletin. He mentioned, by name, that a grower in Sauk County had brought him those papers in 2016, and he had not taken them seriously enough. Willa was in the room. She was sitting in the third row with her father, who had driven to Madison with her because she was presenting in the afternoon session. When Hank Crowley said her name, not her full name, just a young grower in Sauk County, Willa Tesdall, Delmar Tesdall, who was sitting next to her, straightened up in his chair. He did not make a sound, but he straightened up, and he kept his eyes on the front of the room, and his expression was the expression of a man who is quietly, privately, enormously proud. Willa's afternoon presentation was 35 minutes on rootstock selection criteria for upper Midwest soils, with the drainage map, the root depth data, the yield comparison from 2019, and a framework for soil assessment before replanting decisions. She had put it together in the evenings over the previous 6 weeks, working at the kitchen table after her parents had gone to bed. She was 23 years old, and she was standing in front of 200 apple growers telling them something the Extension Service had not told them, and the room was quiet in the way a room gets quiet when people are paying attention. After the presentation, 11 growers came up to ask her questions. 3 of them asked if they could visit the farm in the spring. She said yes to all of them. Let me tell you about the spring of 2020 and what it produced, because this is where the story becomes something larger than one farm. By April of 2020, Willa had been contacted by 26 growers in Sauk, Columbia, and Juneau counties who wanted to discuss rootstock selection for their replanting plans. She was not a consultant. She had no business structure, no fee schedule, no insurance. She was a 23-year-old farmer with a horticulture degree and a green notebook and 3 acres of healthy trees that had survived what 43 other orchards had not. She answered every call. She drove to 11 farms. She looked at soil maps and drainage profiles and asked questions about spring saturation patterns and gave her honest assessment of what rootstock she thought made sense for each situation. She charged nothing. Her mother told her she should charge something. Willa said she'd think about it. She did eventually think about it. By the fall of 2020, she had formalized a simple consulting arrangement, a flat fee for a farm visit and written soil assessment, and she had 17 clients in 3 counties. She was also managing the Tesdall Farm's 40 acres, which in 2020 produced its best overall yield in 12 years, partly because of the weather, and partly because Willa had adjusted the spray timing and the fertilization program based on the soil organic matter data she'd been collecting since 2017. The old trees, her grandfather's original McIntosh and Cortland blocks, the ones that were 59 years old in 2020, the ones that Hank Crowley's predecessors had been suggesting the Tesdalls remove and replant since the early 2000s. Those trees produced 412 bushels off 12 acres. Not a record, not the highest yielding block on the farm, but 412 bushels of fruit that had cost almost nothing to produce because the trees were paid for and established and required no irrigation, no trellis maintenance, no replanting amortization. The per-acre profit on those 12 acres was the highest on the farm. Willa wrote that in her notebook. She underlined it. Let me tell you about what the county looked like by 2022, because the scale of the change is part of what makes the story worth telling. By 2022, the replanting decisions being made in Sauk County looked different from the decisions being made in 2016. Not entirely different. The Geneva series was still being planted, and in the right soil conditions it was still the right choice. But growers were asking questions they hadn't been asking before. They were requesting soil drainage assessments before signing nursery orders. The county extension office had updated its Rootstock recommendation bulletin to include soil texture and drainage qualifications that the previous version had not contained. The Wisconsin Apple Growers Association had published a guide on replanting site assessment that drew directly from the framework Willa had presented in Madison in January of 2020. Hank Crowley's business had changed too. He had hired a soil assessment specialist. He had stopped selling Geneva rootstock trees into the heavy clay townships without a drainage evaluation first. He had lost some sales because of this. Growers who wanted to buy what they'd always bought and didn't want to be told the ground might not support it. He had kept more sales because growers trusted him in a way they hadn't before, which is a particular reward available to people who publicly admit they were wrong about something important. He and Willa had a working relationship by this point, not a warm one. There was too much history for warmth, and Willa was not a person who confused professional respect with personal forgiveness, but a functional one. He referred growers to her for soil assessments. She referred growers to him for nursery stock when the soil profile supported the varieties he carried. It was a practical arrangement between two people who had figured out that the county's apple industry was better served by their cooperation than by their conflict. Let me tell you about the conversation that happened at the Tesdal farm in the fall of 2022, because it is the one that closes this story and opens the next one. Willa was in the barn in October, going through the harvest records and updating the green binder, when her younger brother, Owen, came in from the orchard. Owen was 19 and had been helping with the harvest since he was old enough to carry a picking bag, and he'd been watching his sister manage the farm for 6 years with the particular attention of a younger sibling who was deciding whether to follow or diverge. He sat down on an overturned bin and looked at her for a moment. Then he said he'd been reading about cover crop integration in apple orchards. Specifically, a system being trialed at the University of Vermont where diverse cover crop mixes in the tree rows were showing measurable improvements in soil organic matter, water infiltration, and beneficial insect populations that reduced spray inputs. He had 3 papers. He had printed them out and stapled them together, and he held them out to her. Willa looked at the papers. She looked at her brother. He was 19 years old, and he had 3 papers and an idea that nobody in Sauk County was doing commercially, and that would take 3 to 5 years to show results, and that most growers in the county would consider, at best, an interesting experiment, and, at worst, a waste of ground. She took the papers. She read the first 2 pages of the top one standing there in the barn. Then she said, "Show me the yield data." He showed her. She read it. She asked 3 questions about the trial methodology. He answered 2 of them confidently and admitted he didn't know the answer to the third. She said that was the right answer. Then she said, "Pick a block. We'll try it in the spring." Owen Tesdall looked at his sister the way you look at someone when you were prepared for an argument and didn't get one. She handed the papers back to him and went back to the green binder. He sat there for another moment, then got up and went back out to the orchard. Delmar Tesdall was in the doorway of the barn. He had heard the conversation. He didn't say anything. He just looked at his daughter for a moment, then walked back toward the house. Let me tell you one last thing, because the story doesn't end in a barn in October of 2022, and it doesn't end with a conversation between a sister and a brother, and it doesn't end with a green binder full of yield data and root depth measurements and highlighted research papers. Willa Tesdall still farms those 180 acres on County Road F. The old Macintosh trees her grandfather planted in 1961 are 63 years old now, and they are still producing, and Willa has no plans to remove them. The 3 acres of MM111 trees she planted in 2016 are in full production and have returned more per acre in the past 4 years than any other block on the farm. She still has a notebook from her university years, the one with the Wiersbicki study and the Cornell Bulletin and the Swedish research, and it sits on the kitchen counter next to the green binder, and sometimes growers who come to the farm for a soil consultation pick it up and page through it and look at the margin notes and the highlighted passages and ask her how old she was when she wrote all this. She tells them she was 21. They usually go quiet for a moment. The cover crop trial that Owen proposed is in its 2nd year. The early data is promising. Willa has not told anyone in the county about it yet because she learned in 2016 that there is no point in talking about what the data might show before the data shows it. She is waiting. She is patient. She grew up in an orchard, and an orchard teaches you that the most important work is the work that doesn't look like anything is happening yet. Hank Crowley retired in 2023. At his retirement party at the co-op in Baraboo, he gave a short speech. He talked about 40 years in the nursery business and the growers he'd worked with and the changes he'd seen in the industry. Near the end, he mentioned the 2019 losses and what he'd learned from them. He said that the most important thing a person in his position could do was listen to the people who'd done the reading, especially when, those people were younger than you, or newer than you, or less credentialed than you, or standing in a field with a soil probe and a stack of research papers that you hadn't read yet. He didn't say Willa's name. He didn't need to. Half the people in the room had been to her farm. The ground doesn't read the sign on your dealership. It doesn't care about your sales record or your years of experience or the Extension Service Bulletin from 2010 that told you the Geneva series was the future of Wisconsin apple production. It responds to roots, deep ones, shallow ones, healthy ones, compromised ones. It responds to water and oxygen and organic matter and the patient work of understanding what's actually happening 6 inches below the surface, which is not the same thing as what the catalog says should be happening. Clement Tesdall planted 12 acres of apple trees in 1961 and handed them to his son, who handed them to his granddaughter, who stood in them with a soil probe and a notebook, and told a 61-year-old salesman that the horse didn't need a trellis. She planted old trees in a new rootstock county. They laughed. The wet spring came. The dry summer followed. The new roots drowned and dried and let the blight in. The old roots held, and the only orchard in the northern half of Sauk County with a full harvest that October was the one that belonged to the 23-year-old who'd done the reading.